So a great big spoiler alert to start off. If you haven't seen the Netflix series Beef yet, do not watch this video. Because what I'm going to do is talk about the first episode of it and the last episode of it. Because I want to illustrate one of the stories that Beef tells. So if you've seen it, you know it works on a lot of different levels. It tells a lot of different stories. But one, surprisingly, for something that's so much about anger, it tells the journey of compassion. That is, it talks about how we can start off in a state of dehumanization and rage and transition ultimately to a state of compassion. And it talks about how both those states, this dehumanization and rage, and the compassion, that is basically its polar opposite, how they both function using the same kind of mechanism. So, to start off, the very first episode begins with Danny standing in line wanting to return 3 hibachi grills, right? And a carbon monoxide detector, which seems like a very strange kind of thing to do. And we watch as the cashier humiliates him. The cashier mocks him for not having the receipt on hand. He points out that it's the 3rd time he's tried to return it. And we see Danny get angry, but not expressing that anger. As he walks away, he just mutters under his breath. Then we watch as he goes into his truck and he starts to scream, but he's like, oh, he can't release that scream, right? It's only when he backs up his truck, almost hits Amy, Amy leans on the horn and gives him the finger, that he just suddenly thinks, I'm not going to take this anymore. And he gives himself permission to let that rage go and starts chasing her. So what that illustrates really beautifully is what's called the disinhibition effect. And that is the idea that when we're in close physical proximity to other people, we are inhibited in displaying certain kind of emotional behaviors. For example, we don't want to cry in front of a group of strangers. That's very uncomfortable for us. In this case, Danny feels a lot of anger and rage at the cashier, but he won't express it because he's right there with him and there are people behind watching him as well. It's only when he's in the truck that he's disinhibited. That is to say, he's not prevented from expressing this kind of rage. So we know that this is how road rage works, and we know that this is how, people behave really abysmally when they're online. They send, terrible comments to one another because they're not physically present with the other. They're not inhibited from acting out in that kind of rage. So basically, Danny and Amy too, when they're in their vehicles, they don't see one another. So they can just project whatever it is they want on the other. In this sense, maybe the idea that each represents the way the world is against them, right? And so they can fight back against that by targeting their rage and their anger at one another. And it's really significant for what I'm talking about that at one point in this chase, in episode 1, Danny says, show me your face, show me your face. And he tries to get up to see her, but he can't. So throughout the rest of the episodes, until we get up to episode 10, they do kind of see each other, right? There's several times where they kind of come together. And every time they come together, they learn a little bit more about each other and they learn how they have a lot of things in common, but their anger pulls them apart, right? Until episode 10 begins. So episode 10 begins, they're both driving their vehicles over a cliff, right? Which is metaphorical, I guess, for what their rage has taken them to. Their cars are destroyed. They both lost everything in their lives, right? They injure each other while they're in this ravine. So neither one of them can actually get out now and seek help. So it's just all self-defeating behavior. It's only when they take those poison berries because they have no food or drink and they're immobilized, lying on the ground, hallucinating in one another's bodies, right? Imagining one another's lives and thinking they're both about to die. It's only at that point that they start to reach this kind of sense of really profound connection with one another, which in compassion training we call shared common humanity. So how does that work? Amy sees Danny's life, right? And she sees that Danny was bullied as a child. And basically all he's ever wanted in his life was not to experience that sense of being alone again, right? So he's manipulated his brother Paul so that Paul will never leave him. she realizes that he used those hibachi grills to try to kill himself with, and that when he was returning those grills, it was because he decided not to kill himself. And Danny says, when they wouldn't let me return the grills, I thought it felt to me like the whole world wanted me dead, right? So again, he was reliving this sense of being bullied, but this time by the whole world, and experiencing this sense of being alone in a really deep and profound way. Danny sees in Amy that she's been driven by this deep sense of shame because she feels her parents didn't want her, right? And she's also internalized this idea that she can't express how she really feels about things because if she does, no one will love her. And she's caught in this bind between, on the one hand, wanting unconditional love, right? Because she felt she was never loved. On the other hand, feeling that all love is conditional. So she's really caught in this terrible dilemma. So as they think they're dying then, this is when the act of compassion comes and the act of consoling one another comes. Amy says to Danny, I see your life, you poor thing. You never wanted to be alone, right? And Danny says to Amy, I see it all. You don't have to be ashamed. You don't have to hide anymore. And it's really kind of beautiful. What they're doing in that point is recognizing this common humanity, and this common humanity based on the idea that each one of us is vulnerable to suffering. So they see their own suffering, right? And they see, because it's mirrored back from the other person, but they see that the other is vulnerable to suffering to them, in this suffering as they are in the same way that they are. And so what they do is reach out to each other by saying, you poor thing. And, you know, it's okay for you to be like this. And Danny's saying to Amy, you don't have to hide anymore. It's a beautiful act of compassion, a beautiful way of consoling one another. And then what I find really moving is just as they think they're about to die, I think it's Amy that says, there really is nothing after this. And Danny says, we should have done this more often. And then Amy says, I think, at least we did it once. But it's this idea again that our deepest fears, in the kind of face of our deepest fears, which is there something after death, you know? That what we really have in this life while we're alive is each other and this deep connection to one another. So what they're really doing there is illustrating the value of compassion. Why compassion in modern life that's so hectic, it's so full of competition, and in some sense so meaningless in the way we drive one another and drive our lives to accumulate meaningless things. How the one thing we all have is this humanity and this way of connecting to one another in the deepest sense. So there's a lot more in this series, as I said, because it really is well put together. There's a lot more about compassion, for example, in the way that it illustrates Paul Gilbert's 3 motivational systems, how that last scene illustrates the 4 elements of compassion, which it does. And also something I think that's really important for those of us who have a contemplative practice and who teach contemplative practices like mindfulness and compassion training. And that is the dangers in using a contemplative practice for what psychologists call spiritual bypassing. But how those practices sometimes can be used to avoid having to face what's going on underneath, right? To avoid facing all our uncomfortable feelings. So it does that in a really clever way. So that's my interpretation of one of the stories that Beef tells. If you've seen the series, I'd love to hear what your interpretation is. So please feel free to leave a comment or 2. And thanks for watching. I know it's been a long video. Bye for now.